Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and today's presentation is called, Is Bigfoot an Alien? I've been researching UFOs for many years, but it wasn't long after I started researching in 1986 that I ran into my first case involving UFOs and Bigfoot. I wasn't happy about it. I didn't want it to look into Bigfoot. I was scared it might be real, and it would be opening up a can of worms, and I would have to do a bunch of research into Bigfoot, which is exactly what happened. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence in support of Bigfoot. I know this now. I've had my own encounters. I've talked to people who have had Bigfoot encounters. I've written a couple of books about it. Supernatural California. It covers Bigfoot's history in California, as well as Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Ape Men, which was a book for children. And definitely, Bigfoot is real. And the reason I started researching it was because I started running into these cases in which UFOs and Bigfoot were occurring at the same time. Now this is not a new idea. There's a lot of research into this particular aspect of UFO encounters, and it's fairly well known. Back then I don't think it was nearly as well known, but it was certainly not unknown. Many researchers have uncovered cases like this. And one thing I can say is that most UFO cases do not involve Bigfoot. And for that matter, most Bigfoot cases don't involve UFOs. But in a small handful of cases, these two phenomena intersect perfectly. So there's absolutely and undeniably a very real connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. But what exactly is it? Is Bigfoot an alien? Is there another explanation? That's why I wanted to do this video and sort of explore some cases firsthand and see if we can figure out this mystery and just take a deeper look. So let's get into some of the cases. There's some very interesting cases, and a very early one comes from 1888 from a rancher, a cattleman, who was staying with a tribe of Native Americans over the winter and saw a small group of them heading out into the forest with a platter of meat. And after they had done that a couple of times, he became curious and followed them to a cave. Inside the cave was a Bigfoot-like creature. It was much larger than a man, the rancher said, covered from head to toe in thick fur or hair, and except for the palms of its hands. And the Native Americans told this rancher that they called him Crazy Bear, they called this Bigfoot Crazy Bear, and that he had come from a small moon which had landed and disgorged 3 of these Bigfoot-like creatures. The Native Americans said that there were also small humanoids piloting this UFO. They were dressed in bright silver, shiny uniforms, and that this had happened a number of times before. It didn't happen a lot, but every now and then these UFOs would land and let out Bigfoot-like creatures. It's a very early case, but it's not unique. Another early case was actually investigated by researcher John Keel. He found in the police reports. This was reported to the police on July 31st, 1966. This occurred in an area known as Presque Isle Park in Erie, Pennsylvania, and involves 5 teenagers. There were 3 brothers, their sister Anita Hafley, and another lady by the name of Betty Jean Clem. So they were driving along, and their car got stuck in the sand, and one of the Hafley brothers decided he's going to hike off and get help. And while he's away, the 4 other teenagers are in this car when a UFO hovers overhead, sends down a beam of light. It's not far away. Suddenly this object lands a couple of 100 yards away, and the teenagers are approached by a very tall, hairy, Bigfoot-like creature. It was very menacing. It came up and it scratched the car. They scared it away by flashing the headlights and honking the horn, and it moved off. This was reported to the police. The police found the teenagers very credible. They were scared to death. Furthermore, there was a scratch on the hood of the car where they said the Bigfoot had scratched it. And also there were weird three-toed footprints leading to and from the car to an area 200 yards away where this object had landed, where there was all this crushed vegetation. So a good case, certainly. Yeah, investigated by John Keel. And another one that sort of points towards this UFO-Bigfoot connection. And there are a lot. Consider this case from William Bozak, which occurred in Frederick, Wisconsin in 1974. William Bozak was driving along the highway when he saw a UFO hovering overhead, and as he approached, he could see that there was a porthole, and looking through the porthole, he saw a very large, very tall humanoid. It was covered completely in hair and had very long arms, and looked very much like we describe a Bigfoot today. This is a case that's often cited by researchers who are looking into this area of Bigfoot and UFOs. Another case, which doesn't come from a great source, the Weekly World News, but it's very interesting because they do provide a photograph of the witness. They give his name and the drawings he did of what he said he saw. The witness is Oscar Zamoro. He's an architect who said that he was hiking with another friend, a judge, who was refused to go public, but did give his report anonymously. They came upon a landed UFO while hiking in the Andes in Chile, and it was a 40-foot wide metallic saucer. They were hiking around it, trying to figure out what this thing was, when they came upon a tall, hairy humanoid. They said it had no neck, and shortly after they saw it, this thing walked up to the saucer, climbed a ladder, and into an opening in the side. This ladder retracted. The object took off slowly upwards. Then it let out a big flash of light and darted away. It's definitely another case with this weird Bigfoot UFO connection. Probably the strongest proponent of the UFO Bigfoot connection is Kawani Lapsaritis. He's a scientist who kind of became a Bigfoot researcher because he started having encounters himself, not only with Bigfoot, but with UFOs. They sort of came hand in hand for him. He ended up writing 2 books about his experiences, which he calls The Psychic Sasquatch and the UFO Connection, as well as another book, The Sasquatch People. And according to Kawani, there is a very strong connection between psychic events, telepathy, and UFOs, and that these experiences often come in conjunction with each other. He claims to have had many, many hundreds of encounters with Bigfoot and ETs, both telepathic with both ETs and Bigfoot, and face-to-face, and says that he has actually been taken on board a UFO where he was healed of a herniated disc in his spine. He says he's seen these Sasquatch on board the UFO along with what we would describe as sort of, gray type ETs, but different, short, bald humanoids. And he makes a number of other startling claims. He also claims that there's a base on Earth, underground, which contains both Bigfoot and ETs who are preparing to save humanity from upcoming disasters. That's a theme that turns up in some of these cases. Kawani Lapsaritis writes in his books about many other people who've had psychic Bigfoot experiences. So he's, probably I would say the strongest proponent and a controversial character, but really has spearheaded this idea to some extent. Leo Sprinko actually wrote a foreword for one of Kawani's books, and Leo Sprinko talks about his own case in which he interviewed a gentleman who actually came upon a landed UFO and ETs and a Bigfoot all at once. And apparently the ETs were ordering this Bigfoot around. And this is not the first, the only case involving this sort of thing. There are many. There's another really interesting case which comes from Tammy Chapman. She recently came forward about her encounter at Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta is, of course, known for UFO and Bigfoot encounters. There's a bunch of both of them coming from this area. And she had an experience where she was telepathically communicating with Bigfoot while she was visiting Mount Shasta. And she retreated to her car and was meditating there. She was awake, and suddenly the roof to her car turns transparent, which is something we do see in UFO cases where people's, their roofs will turn transparent in their homes or their walls. And suddenly she looks up through her now transparent roof of her car and sees a UFO. It's at treetop level. And so she was amazed. She was having a UFO and a Bigfoot encounter on the same night. Consider the experiences of Peter Gutilla, who is a Bigfoot researcher. He's put out a number of books on this subject. He was researching a wave of Bigfoot cases up in the Northern California area and did his own stakeout. He heard loud screaming noises, the kinds that people were reporting, actually recorded them. And this was a very remote area, but he says also while he was out there, he heard this strange beeping noise. He couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and this is a very remote area. So this was his first sort of clue that perhaps there is a connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. He would later write about a crash retrieval case, along with a couple of other researchers, which took place in the Vizcaino Desert. This is in Baja, California. And according to Peter Gutilla and the other researchers, this UFO crashed and it was split in two, and what was inside but 4 Bigfoot-like creatures, very tall, large, hairy humanoids. He says all of them were dead. They weren't wearing any clothes except had on what appeared to be sandals and these copper-colored belts with colored lights on them. Otherwise, they were just these hairy humanoids. And he says that they had no hair on their faces, but were otherwise covered with hair, and broad noses and sharp teeth. And that eventually the U.S. military actually took this craft and carried it back to Yuma Air Force Base in Arizona. So it's an interesting case. I don't know how well substantiated it is, but it's certainly an interesting case. So as you can see, there's definitely a strong connection between UFOs and Bigfoot, and sometimes it goes beyond that. Consider what happened to the Bowers family of Washington State. This was a case that was investigated by Lauren Coleman, a cryptozoologist, and Jerome Clark, a UFO researcher. And this case occurred on December 4th, 1970, when a family had a Bigfoot encounter outside their home. They found weird footprints, their dogs had gone crazy. But what's really interesting about it is 3 days following this Bigfoot encounter, they had a very close-up sighting of a UFO hovering right over their home. And following this, they had a huge poltergeist outbreak, which got so bad they ended up fleeing their house. So here we have UFOs and Bigfoot and poltergeists, 3, presumably separate phenomena, all coming together at once. So that's a strange confluence for sure. And we see this in a number of other cases. There was another case which occurred during the Louisiana monster scare. This was in 1972 in the town of Louisiana, Missouri. A bunch of people were seeing a Bigfoot-like creature which became nicknamed Momo the Monster. These were very well authenticated multiple witness sightings all across this town of Louisiana in Missouri. And at the same time, there was a number of UFO sightings in the area. Researchers were not able to link these sightings directly with the Bigfoot encounters, but there was a couple of cases that certainly came close. One was the Rogers family, who said that in August of 1972, they actually lived in Rochdale, Indiana. They had encounters with Bigfoot around their house, that were actually leaving scraps of food for it. It was interesting because it would never leave tracks, even in deep mud. And so that was weird. Dozens of people in the neighborhood saw it. And during this wave of sightings, there was also a UFO seen, and a glowing object hovering over a field where this Bigfoot had been seen. And again, following that, the Rogers family had a poltergeist-like activity appearing in their house. So there does seem to be a direct connection between UFOs, poltergeists, and Bigfoot. Uh, Certainly, it can go even deeper than that. Here's a case which comes from respected and pioneering researcher Don Worley, who did a lot of research from the Midwest, where he was stationed. Here's the cases that I'd like to cite here. Occurred in 1981 in Ohio, where a farm had this UFO hovering overhead, and it was followed by these Bigfoot sightings. And this Bigfoot was really harassing them. They were having a real hard time with it. It was leaving tracks all over the place. It was stealing their livestock, and in some cases just killing chickens and things like this. And that was concerning enough. But sometimes during these encounters, when the Bigfoot was outside the home howling, another strange effect happened. One of the younger members of the family, their son, fell into a trance as if he was being possessed by Bigfoot and was just running around growling and scared the living daylights out of the parents. As the father says, "You didn't see him that night. I did. He was going grr, grr. How would you like your son doing that?" And this is not the only case where a telepathic connection occurs between people and Bigfoot, even to the point of possessing them. One of the leading researchers, I think, into UFOs and the Bigfoot connection is certainly Stan Gordon. He's written a book about this called Silent Invasion, Pennsylvania's UFO Bigfoot Casebook, and has a number of excellent cases in which these two phenomena intersect perfectly. As he says, and I'm quoting Stan Gordon here directly, during the 1973 Pennsylvania outbreak and in a number of subsequent cases, well-documented incidents occurred where both a UFO and a Bigfoot were observed in the same place at the same time by more than one witness. He talks about many, many cases. There was one case where a witness, Stephen Meacham, was apparently possessed by one of these creatures, and following this episode of possession, he experienced other paranormal phenomena such as telepathy and precognition. But Stan Gordon has some truly remarkable cases that I think really cement this connection between UFO and Bigfoot. One case involved three ladies who were driving along a highway and saw a landed UFO, and it was disgorging, quote, several Bigfoot which ran off into the forest, very much like that very first case from the Native Americans. And he cites other cases just like that. He cites at least two cases in which people approached a UFO and were confronted by Bigfoot-like creatures. So although the connection is sort of circumstantial in those cases, there's enough of them, I think, to say that these Bigfoot are running into these UFOs or coming out of them in some cases. Here's a very interesting case, which I think was reported to MUFON. This occurred in Earlham, Iowa, on July 4th, 2002. A father and son were watching fireworks from the roof of their house when suddenly something very strange happened. They heard this very loud whining noise overhead. They couldn't see its source, not at first. But at the same time that they heard this, several other strange things happened. Suddenly, their dogs started barking like crazy. They had cows. The cows started mooing as if they were disturbed. Their porch light dimmed. Their radio, which was playing, suddenly became filled with static. And it was at this point that they saw a Bigfoot run through their yard. A big, tall, hairy, ape-like creature ran right through their yard. And no sooner had it ran past them when something else approached. It was a UFO, a large glowing object, uh, sort of squarish shaped, they said, with a window in it, came zooming overhead, and that was what was making the whining noise. And it moved off, and as it moved off, the kid had a compass. The compass needle actually pointed right towards this object. So it's a very interesting case, which brings these phenomena together perfectly. And there are so many like it. Really, there are. Here's another case from Rich Hills, Missouri, at the Four Rivers Wildlife Conservation Area. This occurred on December 2nd, 2012, when a young man went out hunting and came upon a Bigfoot. He came home, told his father. So his dad and the son went out there with some other people on sort of a stakeout, and what they found was the number of deer carcass, which in the area, and footprints, and they smelled bad smells, heard something tromping through the forest, and at some point also saw these weird glowing orbs, a bunch of them, dozens of them. They actually filmed them for a short period of time, and they finally moved off. Many cases that are really show this very strong connection that point towards Bigfoot being an alien, or at the very least going on UFOs on a regular basis. Here's a case which was reported to either MUFON or New Fork, coming from Brownsville, California, from an elderly couple. They want to remain anonymous. This occurred on November 25th, 2017. And one evening they were drawn outside their home, which is a pretty rural area, but they saw this glowing light in the forest, landed, and they thought it might be a emergency vehicle. But they were wondering what it was doing out there, and so they went out there to look and could see this blinking orange-red light. And as they got close, they realized it looked strange. They couldn't hear any sound. They got scared because they had this distinct feeling of being watched, and they retreated back into the house. And this thing takes off. It's gone. They go to bed, and shortly after they start to go to bed, they hear something digging around in their dumpster. And they look outside through the window, and they think it's a bear at first. And they go out there with a flashlight and a bear banger. A bear banger is like a sound-making device to scare away bears. And as they get outside, they see that this is not a bear at all. This thing stands up on two legs and runs off into the forest. Scared them pretty badly. And they think that this UFO and this Bigfoot are somehow connected because they saw it on the same night, very close to the same time. And there's case after case like this. Again, we've seen UFO or Bigfoot being ordered around by aliens in a couple of cases. Well, here's a case that speaks towards that, and again shows this very strong connection. This case was actually investigated by Leo Sprinkle and a number of other prominent researchers. It occurred in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado in an undisclosed area on a ranch. This was during the mid-1970s. A family had bought a ranch and immediately started to experience a number of unexplained phenomena. It started out with cattle mutilations and UFO sightings. And it wasn't long after that they started having Bigfoot encounters as well. And in fact, on one occasion, while a UFO was hovering overhead, they saw a Bigfoot run across their ranch land. And finally, one evening, the father was out hiking on his land when he came upon a landed UFO and humanoids, human-looking, actually. He said he thought they were human at first until he realized they were wearing weird jumpsuits and their eyes were a little strange. They had very pale skin. were kind of blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and he was talking to them when a Bigfoot approached, and they started ordering this Bigfoot around like it was a pet. So again, we have this sort of very strong connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. And certainly I have my own cases like this. My first case occurred in 1978. I interviewed the witness many years later. His name was Robert. He is a radiologist. He lived in canyon country when this encounter occurred. This is a fairly remote area, certainly was at that time, and lots of canyon lands, and it leads off into the Los Angeles National Forest. And Robert says that one evening he was in his home, which overlooks this sort of wilderness area, and he saw a UFO land in his backyard. It was these bright blue and white lights. And he's looking at it, trying to figure out what it could be. He ran to get his glasses because he's nearsighted, and this thing takes off, and it's gone. He went out there and didn't see any landing traces or anything like that. But it was the next night that he's in his house when suddenly something very strange happens. His dogs start going crazy. They are barking furiously at something in the backyard. And then there's this loud moaning roar. And Robert's freaked out, so are his dogs. And Robert's even more freaked out because he feels himself suddenly telepathically linked up to this creature. He now knows what it is. It's a Bigfoot. And this Bigfoot knows that that Robert can hear him. And this Bigfoot is communicating and saying that it's angry at the dogs. Turns out Bigfoot and dogs do not, generally speaking, get along. This is definitely a thing in Bigfoot accounts. And true in this case. I didn't know that Bigfoot and telepathy was a thing until I ran into this case. I didn't know that UFOs and Bigfoot were a thing until I ran into this case. And this case had all of those. And for Robert, it was a very convincing experience. He's sure this wasn't a bear or a cougar or anything. He says this roar was very hard to describe other than it came from a very large barrel-chested creature. And it was quite frightening, actually. And it was following this event that they had a poltergeist outbreak in their home, which was pretty bad. Doors opening, closing, lights going on and off, cold spots, footsteps, this sort of thing. And this would later be followed by more UFO sightings. So here's this pattern, again, exerting itself where not only UFOs and Bigfoot intersect, but other phenomena, telepathy, and poltergeists. So what is going on here? And Druffel. I started researching this area when I found out about this encounter. I'm like wondering if maybe there's Bigfoot encounters in this area. And sure enough, there is. And researcher Ann Druffel had uncovered cases in this area involving not only Bigfoot and UFO, but psychic phenomena. As she writes, I'm quoting, "Numerous other types of manifestations seem linked to the UFO phenomenon. Sighting locations tend to be infested with poltergeist and other odd paranormal activity. Perhaps strangest of all, Bigfoot activity sometimes coincides with heavy UFO activity. All of these unusual phenomena have been reported in the Tujunga Canyon area," which is not far from canyon country. So yeah, there's definitely a connection between all of these phenomena, and a number of researchers feel like perhaps this phenomena are not only inextricably connected, but they're coming from perhaps the same source. This is sort of the Jacques Vallée, John Keel school of thought. Lauren Coleman, Jerome Clark believe that many times we're not dealing with extraterrestrials in the classic sense, but with a phenomena that perhaps takes on different guises and might not be extraterrestrial at all, or Bigfoot for that matter. I'm not sure if I subscribe to that theory, but it's interesting nevertheless because of these weird connections. D. Scott Rogo is another researcher who is a proponent of this sort of theory. And as he writes, when I first theorized that monsters might be psychic projections similar in nature to UFOs and poltergeists, I also predicted to myself that monster appearances would be accompanied by odd electric anomalies. As I showed earlier, poltergeists and UFOs have an absolute penchant for disrupting everything electrical, from cars to TV sets. And sure enough, it wasn't long before he uncovered at least 2 cases in which the appearance of a Bigfoot caused a car to stall. So yeah, perhaps there is a connection there that we don't fully understand. I'm not sure if that dictates that these are the exact same phenomena, but certainly shows that there's a connection. Probably the ultimate case of this kind that I have, and the last one I'd like to talk about in this presentation, comes from a lady I'll call Wendy. I met Wendy at a Crystal Skull conference, sort of a little meeting, and we became friends. I found out she had had a lifetime of UFO encounters. She's an abductee. She's been taken on board many times. It was very scary for her in the beginning. She's had a lot of sightings, a lot of onboard encounters, physical examinations by gray-type ETs, the hybrid baby phenomena, just very extensive stuff involving onboard experiences. She's been healed by ETs. They removed a cyst from her, once healed her of injuries in a car accident. And she actually showed me a UFO. So I know her cases for real, and was investigating it when one day she calls me up and says, I'm having a problem with Bigfoot. I'm like, what do you mean? No, Bigfoot, really? And she's like, yes, for real. It's telepathically in contact with me. It seems to like me, she says, and it's going around my house. It's causing the dogs to go crazy. The horses next door are stampeding around. She says sometimes it climbs down through the wash near her house. This is in Acton, California, sort of near the Lancaster, Palmdale area, outside of the National Forest, the Los Angeles National Forest. A pretty remote area, but not far off the 5 freeway. And she's like, yeah, this Bigfoot is harassing me. She said she found footprints around her house. Her neighbors were complaining about it. Sometimes it would scream bloody murder, she said, like a woman screaming bloody murder out in the wash. Very high-pitched. And other things like this were happening. One evening, she says it stared at her right through the window and scared the daylights out of her. And that morning, she found out also her roommate had seen it staring in through the window, as had her son. Her son said it climbed up in the tree. He called it the monkey man. So other things happened. She said one night she heard this loud clunking noise on her roof, and the next morning there was this boulder on her roof, this huge rock. She had no idea that Bigfoot are well known for throwing rocks, and it looked as if this one had put it on her roof, sort of as a show of force or a gift, perhaps, because on another occasion she found this animal spine on her front doorstep, and it appeared that this Bigfoot had given it to her. She wonders if it can shapeshift as well, which is something actually other witnesses have reported, because she kept seeing this weird dog kind of circling around her house. And she was in telepathic contact with this thing, and it was telling her that it lived in these caves out in the national forest there, and that it was waiting and preparing for the times when there would be big disasters, and that its job was to help save people from these future upcoming disasters. Just like Kawani Lapsaritis had said, this is what this lady was saying. And it told Wendy that she was involved in this as well. which was related to her UFO encounters, certainly, who were giving her a very similar message of upcoming disasters. So here we have all these elements coming together, and Wendy asked me, she says, I think it wants to kidnap me. I'm afraid it wants to kidnap me. Has this ever happened? And I told her, no, Bigfoot has never kidnapped anybody. I was actually lying to her inadvertently. I didn't know. Turns out there are a number of cases of UFO kidnappings. This is when I had just started my UFO Bigfoot research. So I didn't realize that there were a number of cases involving people who have been kidnapped by Bigfoot. So a very interesting case, to say the least. I went out there. I looked at the tree where this thing had stepped on. I looked at the footprints. They were, I couldn't really tell if they were footprints or not. But I looked at the animal spine that it had left on its front porch. She showed me all of this. And she says, I know where it lives. It's told me. And so we decided to go out there. And what we did is we went out there one evening with all of our equipment, cameras, and sound recording equipment. She says it would come out at night mostly, but she didn't really want to go out there late at night. So we went out there around nightfall at dusk. And when we arrived, it was getting pretty dusky. And it was just beginning to get dark. And she pointed to this. It was several miles from her home. I'm going to say 2 or 3 miles out into the wilderness, into the Los Angeles forest area outside of Acton. And we were along a dirt road that led towards this mountain and this steep valley. And it was very densely packed with brush, very treacherous area. No way you could navigate that. The cliffs and mountainsides were far too steep, certainly for a person to easily do. And she says, that's where it lives. And I looked down in there, and it's a very deep, dark valley. At this point, it was too dark to really see into it. And we had pulled over. I opened the front door. I was driving, and was walking around the front of the car. She opened her door and shut her door and opened the back door and was pulling out the sound equipment and camera equipment when suddenly we heard this loud roar. Very loud, very prolonged. I'm going to say 3 seconds, 4 seconds, maybe a little longer, a little less, and extremely loud. Now, I've heard lions roar. I had a lion roar right next to me at the zoo. I grew up in an area where we had cougars outside our house. I've heard them. Coyote, I know what bears sound like. This was none of those. This is a very loud, very resonant, deep, barrel-chested roar, which went on for a very long time. And Wendy screamed. She was very unhappy. She started scrambling to get back in the car. I ran towards the source of the noise. It seemed pretty close, a couple of 100 yards away, but I couldn't tell for sure because it echoed all around us. I actually looked up, wondering if it could be a jet. And this thing roars again, seconds later. And that time I knew where it was. It was definitely down in that dark, dark valley there, just 100 yards away maybe. And Wendy's screaming at me to get back in the car. She does not want to stay any longer. I wanted to stay, but she was too scared, so I went back into the car reluctantly and we drove off. But yeah, I had my own Bigfoot encounter. Pretty much convinced it's real because of not only that, but certainly because of the research I've done. I've researched a number of other cases. I know of one case where a gentleman came upon a Bigfoot and was telepathically communicating with it, and it told him they have the ability to turn invisible, and actually demonstrated for him. And shortly after that, he saw not only the Bigfoot, but a female Bigfoot and a child Bigfoot, an infant Bigfoot. And all three of them disappeared, and it was a brief encounter, but showed that these are not perhaps normal hominids or primates as we might think of them. So again, there's been a lot of research into this area. I wrote about it in my book, Not From Here, Volume 3. in which I covered the UFO, Bigfoot, poltergeist connection. And now there are a lot more cases, many of which I've presented here. One researcher I'm very impressed, his work is Jose Antonio Caravaca. He's looked very deeply into this. And it's clear to me that Bigfoot is real, but most cases don't involve UFOs. So I'm thinking that Bigfoot is probably an intelligent primate that's been coexisting along with humanity for millennia, but staying out of humanity's way, out in mostly the wilderness areas, and does have what we would term to be supernatural or psychic abilities, which aren't really supernatural at all. They're just connected to it. They have the ability to perhaps slip into other dimensions and turn invisible, which I know how it sounds, but this seems to be what we're dealing with here and could explain this connection. Another connection I think that is really sort of answers a lot of the mystery surrounding this is the telepathic connection. And that perhaps this is why UFOs and Bigfoot are so well connected, because they can communicate telepathically so easily with each other. And the fact that there are multiple cases of Bigfoot and Sasquatch exiting or entering or being seen inside UFOs, I think shows that there is a strong connection. But I don't think this necessarily means that they are extraterrestrials in the classic sense. Intelligent beings coming from other planets who are building spaceships. I think actually my assessment is that most of these cases involving UFO and Bigfoot is just sort of this telepathic Bigfoot. And UFOs are contacting all kinds of people, including Bigfoot. And for that matter, they're taking all kinds of animals on board as well. So it shouldn't be any surprise that if Bigfoot exists, and I think they do, that they're also being taken on board. So I'm not sure if they're actually building these craft themselves, but you know, there are a few cases where people have reported Bigfoot piloting these craft. So I am willing to leave open the possibility that there are extraterrestrials out there who are 8 foot tall and covered with hair, like the Wookiee in Star Wars. So perhaps that's what we are dealing with here. So it's my assessment, my conclusion that in some cases, yes, perhaps Bigfoot is an alien. But in most of the cases we're seeing here, no, I think we're probably dealing with an intelligent and very mysterious hominid, a primate very much like us, who has been coexisting along with humanity for centuries and is also interacting with extraterrestrials on a regular basis. That is actually what I think is going on. And I think the telepathic connection sort of ties into all this. Perhaps the genetic connection, the fact that ETs seem to be very interested in hybridization, that might tie into all of this. At any rate, it's still a mystery. A lot of people are interested in it, and I've researched my own cases, and I'm absolutely convinced there is a connection, and that's why I wanted to put this video together for you all. So many cases that point towards this. So that's it for now. Once again, thanks for listening, and even more important, keep having fun.